Hey everyone, welcome to week 2 of November. If you've been following along with the writing challenge, you've probably been writing for about a week and a half now. This week, I'm going to talk to you guys about sensory detail, vivid descriptions, and a little bit of world building to help you boost your word count and make your scenes and your characters sound more exciting through language. I'm going to start off this week by talking about writer's block. If you're not feeling it, awesome. I'm glad that you're super engaged in your story. If you're starting to feel it even a little bit, this is an exercise you can try to get a different perspective. If you want to, you can go ahead and stop and do a little bit of brainstorming now with that, or you can come back to it later when and if you feel writer's block. Okay. So I'm going to kick off today with this quote, and I'm going to talk a little bit about world building right after. And I could do such a long workshop just on world building alone. So I'm going to give you just a few slides. It's kind of a crash course in what to think about when you're trying to build up a world, particularly if you're working on science fiction, fantasy, any kind of world that is vastly different from our own. But this quote from Ron Rosell in Description and Setting, which is a book I'll talk to you a little bit about later, says, "The location and time frame of your story is more than just a stage for your characters to tromp around on. In some cases, the setting becomes a character itself. And all of the attendant details, societal conventions, seashores, mountains, regional dialects, determine the overall tone. In fact, if you do it right, setting and description become essential in your fiction. They become the foundation for the rest of your story to build on." I'm going to kick off the world building crash course, like I mentioned. I'm going to give you a list that looks kind of like this one in 3 different parts. That's just quick bullet point reminders of things that you might want to think about when you're talking about or planning the background and the world itself for your story, which you may have already done a little bit of. You may find that you need to do a little more of. And you may find that you have an opportunity to talk about those conventions in your story, okay, which can help you with your word count. So when you're thinking about the physical world, that includes things like the stuff that goes on your map. You want to think about your landscape and what's included with that. So you can be your coastlines, your mountain ranges, your forests, your cities. You want to think about your climate. Is your character living in a tropical world? Are they living in the tundra? How does that change how they react to the world? How they need to think about it to get by? You want to think about your plants and animals. Those may not be super important in your story, but it kind of goes along with your landscape and just the general backdrop for your story. So you may need to describe some of those things just kind of in passing to set the scene a little bit for your readers so they know where your story is taking place. If you're in outer space, you might be thinking about your solar system. It can also include the more mundane, so very specific locations like the town that your character lives in, the buildings that they frequent, the rooms that are most important to them, which could be their bedroom, one of their favorite classes at school, that classroom, different things like that. You'll want to know what those spaces look like, because in most cases you probably will talk about your character moving about that space or interacting with items in that space. So you want to know what that looks like. Also talk a little bit about magic, and this will be on every slide, so I'll explain it a little bit differently. But in this particular facet of world building, the physical world, when you think about magic in this sense, you're talking about how does it work? What are the physics of magic? And I could go on for so long about just magic systems in and of themselves. But if you're planning to use magic, you want to think about some of the rules for how your magic works, where it comes from, how you activate it, those type of things. Is it innate in your characters, or is it something they have to learn about? Okay. Next checklist that I want you to think about is your cultural world. So when you're doing that, you want to think governments and laws. What does the government look like? Are there any laws that specifically affect your characters, positively or negatively? You want to think about the religions or cultural values that are important in your societies. Technology, art, entertainment, all the stuff that humans create, either to help themselves or to entertain themselves. Those are things you might think of, especially if you have a vastly different world from ours. You may want to talk about folklore, myths, legends, the stories that the common people tell each other in your world, or the things that are important, or the boogeymen, you know, the little everyday stories. Language is always an interesting aspect, especially if you're talking about high fantasy. You might think of books like Lord of the Rings, you're talking about Elvish, those kind of languages that are completely made up, but they're built on the same principles that real world languages are. You don't have to do that, but it's something you could think about. You might also think about holidays, any rituals or observances that are important in your world to your characters. Time period is reflected in a lot of these areas. So depending on the time, especially if you're talking maybe historical fiction, that will definitely influence which laws are in effect, which technology exists, different items like that. And when we're thinking about magic from the cultural perspective, we're talking about what is it used for? So is magic used for healing? Is it used for warfare? Different considerations like that. And the last big list I've got for you to think about when you're considering your own world building is your social world. And so those are kind of the relationships between people and between groups that exist within the bounds of your story. So you might think of politics or foreign policy if you're talking at the government level, or different laws. You're talking about race and the different types of people that exist in your world, or if you're doing a fantasy story, it could be the different types of species that exist in your world. Same thing for science fiction. If you have, an intergalactic federation, they don't all look human. You're thinking about gender roles and how that affects the way your character walks through the world, the problems that they face, or the privileges that they face because of those roles that they have. Social classes. So you're thinking about how your society thinks about those who maybe have more money, less money. It might be, if you have magic, those who use magic and those who don't, and whether that's taboo or considered exceptional, those different types of things. But you also want to consider, what are the differences between those classes in appearance, the professions they're allowed to hold, the resources they have access to. You may be thinking history as well, so different, in this case, traumatic events might be. So if you have a war or an uprising, that might be something you talk about for your characters, because that will likely, if it was big enough, affect their present day in some way. Or power shifts as well. So if you're living in a country that's been taken over by a rival kingdom, or a military coup, or some kind of shift in the power dynamic, maybe magic suddenly popped into your world and no one had it before, but those who have it now have power over everyone. Those things will have a very big effect on the characters moving through your story. So you may know the backstory of your world. It may not be super important, some of those big events. The ones you want to highlight are the ones that affect the plot or people's interactions. Okay. And when you're talking about magic systems, the social world affects who has magic. Do the elites have magic? Is it something, again, like I said, if it's taboo, is it something that people hide and don't talk about that they use? Is it something that belongs to healers or battle mages or different things like that. Does having magic acquire you privileges, or is it something that keeps you oppressed? So a lot of big topics to think about, but it's good to have a checklist to kind of think about those if you know they're going to affect your story. This is just an exercise you can do if you're thinking about world building. You can skip it if you think you've already got a solid foundation and you're already halfway through your story, or you're chugging along. If you find you're having problems with continuity based on needing a little more world building for your story, you might come back to this. All right, I'm going to switch gears. That is your quick crash course in world building. There's way more out there, and I will recommend some titles at the end of this if you have questions or you want to think more about your world building. But I'm going to change directions now over to writing description. And I've got two quotes here from two pretty well-known authors. Flannery O'Connor says, fiction writing is very seldom a matter of saying things. It's a matter of showing things. And similarly, Anton Chekhov, a Russian writer, says, don't tell me the moon is shining. Show me the glint of light on broken glass. And what they're getting at here is, you may have heard it in school, you may not. It's the idea of show versus tell. And it deals with how you relay information to your reader. So I'm going to get into what that means, your show versus tell, and then I'm also going to talk to you about ways to kind of create more interesting descriptions. So you can find information about this topic, kind of show versus tell, and in your novel workbook on page 30, and it's got some exercises for you to try and things to fill out, so you may try that. But I'm also going to talk you through a few things that will kind of help you navigate this idea. So the difference between showing and telling is much like the difference between being at a party yourself and having a great time and hearing about it afterwards from friends. Very different experience, right? So you're going to use both types of writing throughout your story. There's a place for both because you don't always need really flowery language if you're just trying to give really important facts reporting the events that happened. But it's always a really great idea to invite your reader into the party, so to speak, so that they can experience the scene for themselves. And that's where you want to use here in the third bullet point, your sensory details. You want to give vivid descriptions of body language. So not just saying how your character's feeling, but showing how they might be feeling, nervous or happy or excited through what they're doing with their body. So it could be a nervous fidget. It could be a smile or a smile they're trying to hide, different things like that. It kind of brings them to life more, makes them more of a 3D character. This book is a little bit old, but I remember reading it when I was in school, and I have a passage that I'll read out to you. But the essence of that passage can be stated in this sentence right here, which says, the plane crashed into the lake and Brian managed to get out, which is pretty straightforward. It's a reporting of the events. It tells you exactly what happened, but it's not exciting. So we're going to look at the actual passage written by Gary Paulson that kind of shows you how you can use your words and the way you describe an event to give it feeling and emotion. Then a wild crashing sound, ripping of metal, and the plane rolled to the right and blew through the trees, out over the water and down, down to slam into the lake. Skip once on water as hard as concrete, water that tore the windshield out and shattered the side windows, water that drove him back into the seat. Somebody was screaming as the plane drove down into the water. Someone screamed tight animal screams of fear and pain, and he did not know that it was his sound, that he roared against the water that took him and the plane still deeper down into the water. He saw nothing but sensed blue, cold blue-green, and he raked at the seatbelt catch, tore his nails loose on one hand. He ripped at it until it released, and somehow, the water trying to kill him, to end him, somehow he pulled himself out of the shattered front window and clawed up into the blue, felt something hold him back, felt his windbreaker tear, and he was free, tearing free, ripping free. So as you can see, this scene sounds way different from the sentence that painted it earlier. It was a very emotional scene. He's feeling a lot of fear, and he's not thinking clearly. And you can tell from the way that the author has written very long sentences that they don't stop. There's not as many periods as there are commas, which is something we won't really get into, but it's a way of telling the story. So I pause at a comma, I don't stop. So it happens really fast. The sentences just keep rolling at you, one after another, and you start to feel kind of that panic, that breathlessness that he's feeling as he's trying to escape. And so it's a really effective way of bringing that emotion to your reader and making them feel it. I've got a little exercise here. It's not a full-on writing prompt, but it's just something to get you thinking about a mysterious scene. So this is a statue that I picked up from a market in Europe, and it just looked really interesting to me. But I think that it's also a really interesting way to kind of jump off of and trying to write about an object that is mysterious or seems mysterious or majestic. So if you want to, you can try and write a short scene. This probably won't fit in with your story very well, but it's a fun little writing exercise you can do anyway. You can write a scene about someone encountering this object, either the small version itself or maybe a large statue that looks like it. And jump on into sensory details now for you guys. So this goes along with your showing and telling information. One of the ways that you can show your characters or bring them into the experience is by using the senses. It makes it more immersive. So you can use your sight, your smell, taste, feel, sound, those different types of details. So the reader can relate to your scene and what's happening to your character. You don't need to use all of them in every scene. I mean, sometimes you don't want to do too much telling, so people try and overload with details, and that can be a great exercise as you're doing your first draft. But when you come back and you're looking at it after your challenge is done, you may want to revise or edit down so that you just have one or two types of senses per scene that really evoke what you need. It's not too much, but it's just right. So in that case, quality of detail is more important than quantity. You may only use one of these, and it may be a relatively short paragraph, but if it's really packing a punch, that doesn't matter. So if you're in a scene where you're cooking with your grandma, then you may want to talk about smells, maybe even taste, if you're taste testing the food, and helping along. And those can create really evocative scenes that really put us there with you. It might be very different if you are writing a character who is fighting their way through a swamp. You might talk about the smell because it may stink, but you might also talk about the feel of the mud and the gushy water under their feet that they're trying to fight their way through, or branches smacking them in the face because everything's so close, and the dense heat of it, all of those details. Word choice can be very important when it comes to sensory details, because there's a very different meaning between the word odor and the word aroma, even though they both refer to smells. Okay. And there is inside the workbook, as I've mentioned here, there are some exercises specifically based on sensory details on page 55. And they actually go on for I believe, to page 68. They give you quite a few pages of hypothetical scenes or experiences that you can then go through and write the sight, smell, taste, feel, and sound of, which you may want to try if you are unfamiliar with this, but you don't necessarily need to do. It's all up to you and your writing process. Before we move on, So we're almost done. Figurative language is also something to think about when you're talking about your details and your descriptions of scenes. It can make it really interesting and different. So I've got a few different types of figurative language that you may have talked about in school, and just a few examples. So like personification, when I say the mirror stood beside the window and hid itself behind the ivy plants, the mirror is not capable of physically hiding like a human can do, but it gives you a sense of the way that the mirror might be enveloped by those ivy plants. It's almost hidden, like it was trying to hide itself. You've also got things like metaphors here. So his fingers over the piano keys were birds dipping in and out of whitecaps. This is actually, it gives you an idea of the way his fingers are moving as if they were birds flying between, waves in the ocean. It's a very fluid feeling, very graceful, and it gives you that idea. I'm going to skip ahead a slide real quick and just talk about why you might want to bother with sensory details, vivid descriptions, figurative language, and all that stuff in your story, especially if you've never done it before. And one of the big things is it boosts your word count. Adding in those descriptions, even if you ultimately decide to take them out from your final version of the story, it gives you a chance to play with different descriptions, explore some options, which, may work. They may just be the perfect line that you need for your story. But all those, you're ultimately trying to reach that word count as well, so it helps you get there. So if you write something and you're like, I'm not sure I like that exactly, maybe I'll try something different, don't delete it, because it's working towards your word count for you. It also keeps your writing from sounding cliched and overused. I'm sure you've read a story where the author has just, you hear a line that you've read in every book you've ever seen, or every magazine article, or you've heard all over, TV. The great thing about using a description that builds on your own sensory experiences or your own metaphors and similes and things like that is that your experiences might lead to a description that no one else has thought of before, because your experience of the world may be completely different than someone else's. So that's a really neat thing. It also gives you a chance to change the way your reader understands a scene by being more specific and choosy about your language. So I've got 3 descriptions here. They all talk about the same event, but they all feel different. So I can say her heart beat rapidly. And depending on the context of the story, it could mean a few different things. If I say her heart fluttered, to me that signifies a little bit more of a romantic kind of connotation for that scene. But if I use the last one, ba-boom, ba-boom, she felt it in her temples, in her fingers, and most distinctly in her chest. To me, that sounds more like a description you might find in a horror story. So depending on what kind of genre you're working in, depending on how you want your readers to feel, you can change those descriptions and use different types of figurative language. Like this here is some onomatopoeia, which I didn't mention in the last slide, but it's something you can try. I'm going to go back to that slide. I'm going to pause here just so you can see it in case you want to try this in your writing. But I am going to move on because right on my next slide, I do have a few different kinds of writing prompts for you. This is just a way of working on maybe the sensory details, and it may work for your story or it may not. And you can always tweak the prompt as needed if you're trying to write a scene for your story. But one way to kind of think about how important sensory details are is to write from the perspective that your blind friend is walking through one of your favorite places, street you live on, your neighborhood, and it gives you the chance to really think about that place in minute detail level, and then you describe that journey in the sounds they hear, the scents they smell, obviously everything except for what they can see because they can't see it. So it's a different way of thinking about those places for yourself. You could also think about it from the perspective of you are the protagonist and whatever room you're in right now is the beginning of your story. So if you're writing that story, how would you set that scene? How would you set the room and the tone using your senses and your vivid descriptions? Okay. All right, but the real writing prompts, like I'll have at the end of every video this month, I've got 3 here for you. This first one up at the top is the, just keep going prompt. So if you're on a roll with your story, you know exactly what you want to say, keep to it. But remember to try and add a little more sensory description, a little more figurative detail to kind of boost your word count and make it come alive for your audience. Okay. The second one is mainly focused on adding in details to a previous scene, with the caveat that I'm not asking you to rewrite a scene because we're not trying to mess with your word count. But if you have a scene that you like, or maybe you think it came across as a little dull, go back and add detail in. So you're boosting that word count still. You're not writing a new scene, but you are adding on to the story in a way that makes it more vivid and more exciting. Okay. The last one I've got for you is a new scene. So you may not be to the point where you've got a ton of tension yet, and that's totally fine. But if you do have a scene, maybe your character has just experienced like a really tough trial. They just barely made it out of something that they got stuck in, or they, ran into someone related to their antagonist that was intent on stopping them from whatever they were trying to do. Think about the moment after that, after they've escaped and they have a second to breathe. What are they feeling? What are they experiencing around them? What does the room look like? Is it everyone is kind of just sitting around defeated? Is there a flurry of motion? Everyone's, trying to respond. But think about the things that they might have the time to notice that they didn't before. And so even if your room is a flurry of activity, maybe your character is at the center and they are the silent, unmoving, they're just watching everything happen around them, and you have the opportunity to describe that. All right, so I'm giving you a few prompts today that hopefully can help you boost your word counts, give you ideas of more vivid descriptions, and really have you jump into your story and feel excited about it. If you're interested in learning a little bit more about the craft of writing from the perspective of world building, writing description, setting the scene for your reader, I've got 2 books that I have on my personal shelf at home, but they're also available through the Bellwood Library system. If we don't have it on the shelf, we can get it through interlibrary loans, so you can go online and put a hold on those. And if you are interested in map building for a world, if you're working on a really highly fictional world, fantasy or science fiction, you might try going to this link that I've got over here. And I will link to that as well in the video description. But it's got some pretty great information on creating maps for your fictional worlds. Before next week, I'm going to be talking about building conflict and tension next week. So you'll want to consider where you're at maybe on this plot. And remember, we talked about you may not be using this exact same plotting model, but it's still a good way to think about, those escalating points of tension that are taking place. So where are you in your story on this chart? Where do your last few scenes fall? What are you planning to write next? You can start building that and amping that tension up, but you want to try as you're going along to try and escalate little by little, build the stakes higher and higher as you're writing at home. I'm glad you joined me this week. I hope that this information was helpful in your writing process, and good luck with your stories. I'll see you next week.